And finally, now we come to the unhappy conclusion of the Sicilian expedition, in which we see total, complete defeat of the Athenian forces at Syracuse. Now, at the conclusion of the last video, we talked about how the Athenians had tried to counterattack the blockading efforts of the Syracusans in the Great Harbor. Now, in that effort, the general Eurymedon was killed, and so therefore Nicias and Demosthenes were the only ones left. Now, this is where Demosthenes remembered that he had a lot of experience with nighttime attacks, and so the Athenians under Demosthenes excuse me, tried to come up with a plan to circle around their wall and come down at the city of Syracuse directly through the plain called Epipolae that lay right outside the city to the northwest. Now, when they organized this plan, Demosthenes trained all of the soldiers how to carry out night attacks. On that night, the Athenians were able to get themselves in position and make the strike down the plain. And although the Syracusans found the Athenians there and were able to resist them, the Athenians were able to break that initial Syracusan resistance and press on, and were almost able actually to invade the city itself. But it failed. And the reason it failed, according to Thucydides, is that the Athenians used a password system to keep track of exactly where everybody was in the army. And remember, the Athenians had not been well practiced for a long time at nighttime attacks. So this was not a system they were all that familiar with. Somehow, in the middle of the campaign, one or more Syracusans must have heard this password and possibly repeated it. As a result, some accidental confusion sprung up as to exactly who was Athenian and who was Syracusan. When the Syracusans realized that this was actually a password for identification purposes, they latched onto that and started actually repeating the password deliberately. As a consequence, the Athenian campaign was completely thrown into confusion, and eventually the Athenians retreated. And the Syracusans, of course, forced them back. So now the Athenians had lost their opportunity both to escape at sea and also to carry out this land attack, because the Spartans and Syracusans sealed that area off to prevent another strike. Still, however, the Syracusans didn't get the harbor blockaded completely. So this brings us now to where we were at the end of the last video, which is that Nicias and Demosthenes now had to decide whether or not to evacuate. And they did, because Nicias gave up on the plan from before, expecting a betrayal of the city. However, on the night when they were about to leave, 413 BC, in August, under a full moon, the moon went into eclipse. See, I had an eclipse of my own. Okay, as a result of that, Nicias panicked because he was a superstitious type and saw the lunar eclipse as a bad omen. As a result, he consulted his soothsayer, who warned him of impending danger within the full moon period of 27 days. And Nicias took that to mean that no expedition should be initiated in a 27-day period. That was probably a wrong interpretation, but it was the one Nicias latched onto. As a consequence, the Athenian ships stayed. And then finally, on the next day, the Syracusans, to their surprise, were able to move in and complete the blockade. And now the Athenians were completely sealed in. The only way now for the Athenians to actually break this blockade, therefore, as they saw it, was to try one more strike. They organized their ships as before, but they made one major change. They now put a lot of their land forces on board the ships, so that the land forces would be able to attack the ships directly and even be able to invade them and be able to fight the inhabitants of the other ships, the rowers, in hand-to-hand combat. In addition to that, the Athenians gave themselves grappling hooks that were supposed to be used to be thrown over to the other ship and be able to latch onto it so that it would eventually be drawn in and would allow the Athenians to board it. However, somehow word, I guess from a spy, got over to the Syracusans about this, and the Syracusans quickly got their ships ready by putting canvas, stretching it all around the outer edge of the ship, to be able to protect the ship from being grabbed onto by the grappling hook. So that expedient of the Athenians ended up rendered useless. Still, though, the Athenians probably could rely on their ramming techniques and probably still had the upper hand against the Syracusans and the Spartans in this combat. So Nicias gave words of encouragement to the Athenians. Gylippus gave words of encouragement to the Spartans. The Athenians, who are right here in our little diagram on the harbor, moved out into the center of the harbor here. Here are the Syracusans trying to hold the blockade in red. The Athenians came out, the Syracusans came out, and probably, from our reconstruction, they probably met in the middle of the harbor right there. Once they met, the fighting spread all around the harbor, all the ships trying to ram each other. We have a really dramatic, powerful piece of reading from Thucydides describing this battle as one of the noisiest and probably largest sea battles that Thucydides had witnessed. It must have been a really incredibly dramatic affair, and the Athenian men were lined up over here on the harbor watching, and apparently their bodies were swaying back and forth where they weren't certain whether or not their men were winning or losing. They were either captivated or scared to death whether they thought they were winning or losing, and swaying back and forth with their bodies like this, wondering what was going to happen. Well, after this really powerful battle, the Syracusans finally, at a crucial moment, were able to turn the Athenian resistance, probably somewhere here, back to the harbor. And as a consequence, the Athenians rushed on shore. The Syracusans finally got themselves organized and chased them down and forced them back onto the shore, and were able to reinforce the blockade. However, the Syracusans got drunk again. So the Athenians actually realized in witnessing this that the Syracusans lost more ships in that battle than the Athenians did. So Nicias and Demosthenes realized that if they could quickly get all their men back on board the ships right away, they could actually strike again and probably break their way out this time. But when the Nicias and Demosthenes went around to all the men to get them reorganized, the men refused to get on board. They were too demoralized. As a result, the Athenians, the next day, and in fact it was another day after that, now tried to retreat on land. They had some far-off allied cities that they hoped to reach if they did retreat on land. Nicias was going to take part of the army one way. Demosthenes was going to take part of the army the other way, in order for the hope that one of them would be able to arrive, that the Syracusans would be unable to stop both of them. Unfortunately, however, they delayed leaving, and as a result, the Syracusans got word out to their nearer allies, and those allies were able to get all of the roads cut off in time so that the Athenians were unable to leave. And finally, when the Athenians did actually get out on the road, it was too late. All of the ways were blocked. Eventually, Nicias and Demosthenes got into confusion and lost track of each other, and with their armies split and losing direction and orientation, eventually all the Athenians in both sections were hunted down. There was a really drastic scene near the end of the expedition in which a bunch of men came into a river. They were really thirsty, and they immediately rushed to the river and started drinking. But unfortunately, there was an ambush there, and the enemy came in and slaughtered the men as the men were drinking desperately, trying to slake their by then overwhelming thirst. As a result, in that final sort of non-battle, the Athenians were at last vanquished, and they were taken prisoner. Nicias and Demosthenes, both in their separate sections, surrendered. There were some negotiations among the remaining Athenian leadership to try to get them free, but the Syracusans eventually would not listen, and they slaughtered both Nicias and Demosthenes, as well as all the other Athenians. They were kept in pits underground, quite disgusting, for the period of their imprisonment. They were basically prisoners of war at this point, and the only ones who were set free were those who were able to recite verses of Euripides. But otherwise, every single one of them was killed. So only any random Athenians who were able to get away themselves were around as survivors to flee back to Athens and inform the Athenians of what terrible tragedy had occurred in Sicily. So according to the historian Thucydides, this was the biggest undertaking the Athenians had ever had, and in his memory, it was the largest, most significant single military disaster any city had undergone. The Athenians were, first of all, in disbelief when the first reports came in of the defeat. When finally the survivors arrived and confirmed it beyond any reasonable doubt, the Athenians went through a mourning period. The news was simply heartbreaking for them. And of course, by that time, they had actually restarted the war with Sparta, so now they were really in serious trouble. However, the Spartans once again did not respond as they could have. So although the Athenians were devastated by this loss, they were still able to cobble together enough resources to be able to rebuild their fleet. However, in the process of that, they also started doing a reinvestigation of their democracy to find out what had gone wrong to allow the voting in of such an expedition. That in itself would have really unfortunate consequences, as we will discuss in our next video. We'll see you very shortly.